Only 15. She told the Daily Mail, "I don't deny that we do look alike, but I couldn't ever compete with Diana's image." Can a conversation bring down a monarchy? You might not think so, but the Duchess of Edinburgh once came pretty close to pulling it.
And why do people think Sophie holds the royal family together? Here's what we know.
Occasions, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, has caused a stir with her eyebrow-raising fashion choices.
From a working girl to a duchess wasn't the only change Sophie Rhys-Jones encountered after marrying Prince Edward.
Duchess of Edinburgh and the Princess of Wales. Two women who are similar in more ways than one. But how did they actually feel about each other? Harry and Meghan's Brexit, William and Catherine joined forces with Prince Edward and his wife Sophie, and the four get along like lifelong pals. For the royal family, enjoying the finer things in life is part of the job, and that's certainly the case for Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Until an investigative reporter posing as a prospective client got Sophie to say incriminating things about the royal family.
There were no official ceremonial or military activities as part of the festivities. The bride's gown appeared simple and
Fiorito of the Royally Obsessed podcast commented on how inappropriate this outfit really was, saying,
Wasn't raised in a royal environment, but that didn't prevent her parents from giving her a top-notch education. She started
3 words. That's all it took for the Queen to end a scandal that nearly derailed a royal wedding. Not a statement from Buckingham Palace, not a carefully worded press release, drafted and redrafted by aides who spent their careers softening the monarch's language for public consumption. Just 3 words, spoken privately, about a woman who sold her friend's most vulnerable moment for £40,000, premeditated cruelty. That's what Queen Elizabeth called it. And according to a new biography, that judgment changed everything. Not just for the woman who leaked the photos, but for how the entire royal family responded to the crisis unfolding around one of its newest members. If you want more deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe to Royal Archives. The wedding was scheduled for June 19, 1999. Sophie Rhys-Jones was set to marry Prince Edward at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the same chapel where Harry and Meghan would say their vows 19 years later. Everything was in place. The dress had been finished for weeks. The guest list was locked. Foreign dignitaries had confirmed attendance. And then, with the wedding closing in, a decade-old set of photographs landed on the desk of the Sun's editor, David Yelland. The images showed a 23-year-old Sophie on holiday in Spain, topless, laughing alongside radio presenter Chris Tarrant. She'd worked with Tarrant years earlier at Capital Radio, back when she ran her own public relations firm and moved easily through broadcasting circles in London. The photos were old. They belonged to a version of her life that predated the royal family entirely. And they were about to become the property of millions of newspaper readers, courtesy of someone Sophie had trusted without question. That someone was Cara Noble, a former colleague, a friend by most accounts, close enough that Sophie never imagined betrayal was even possible from that direction. According to royal biographer Sean Smith, whose 2025 book Sophie, Saving the Royal Family lays out the episode in granular detail, Noble had explicitly promised Sophie those images would never see daylight. Some promises, apparently, have a price. Noble sold them to the Sun for £40,000. The paper ran one under the headline, Sophie just laughed as Chris pulled up her bikini. Playful, breezy, dismissive. As if this were a punchline instead of a violation of someone's private life, timed for maximum damage right before her wedding day. Smith writes that Sophie feared the images could unravel everything she'd built toward that moment. Not just her public image, though that mattered too. Her sense of safety around people she thought she'd known. Murray Harkin, Sophie's former business partner in her PR firm, told Smith what happened the moment the story broke. Sophie called him. Early morning, in what he described as floods of tears. She wasn't performing distress for sympathy. There was no audience yet, no cameras, no palace advisors standing by to manage optics. Just a woman who felt, in Harkin's words, like she was letting the side down. Weeks before marrying into the most scrutinized family in Britain. And she believed in that moment that she'd become the liability everyone had quietly worried about. That's the part most people miss when they hear royal scandal. They assume the family closes ranks against the person at the center of the storm, protects the institution first, the individual second, and lets the newcomer twist a little in the process. That's certainly the pattern the tabloids expected in 1999. Editors across Fleet Street were waiting to see whether Buckingham Palace would quietly distance itself from Sophie, whether this would become a story about her judgment rather than someone else's betrayal, whether history would repeat the pattern it had followed with other royal in-laws who found themselves under sudden, unforgiving scrutiny. It didn't happen that way. And the reason it didn't traces directly back to the Queen, because here's where the story shifts. Smith's book reveals that Queen Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for a formal briefing from communications staff. Didn't ask whether the story might embarrass the family or whether standing firmly behind Sophie carried any risk to the monarchy's image. Didn't treat Sophie's crisis as a threat to be managed at arm's length, the way institutions often manage the personal disasters of people who haven't yet proven their loyalty. She called it what it was: premeditated cruelty, not carelessness, not an unfortunate lapse in judgment from an old friend caught in a difficult moment. Cruelty, planned, timed, and executed for profit, aimed at a young woman weeks from the biggest day of her life. Those who worked around the Queen during that period described her support for Sophie as unwavering. That word matters. It's not a word palace insiders use loosely about the monarch's private reactions, and it's not the kind of word that appears in careful, hedged briefings designed to protect every angle. It suggests something closer to certainty, the kind that doesn't waver even when the easier, safer institutional move would have been distance or silence, or a carefully worded statement that left room to walk things back later if public opinion shifted. And Sophie wasn't just protected in private. The entire narrative around the scandal began shifting almost immediately, in a way that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. Instead of Sophie facing backlash for photographs taken a decade earlier, in a life she'd lived long before any of this, the backlash redirected. Toward the newspaper that ran them, toward Cara Noble, the friend who sold them, toward the choice to trade a decade-old private memory for a payday timed to inflict maximum embarrassment. The Sun's editor tried an early statement defending the decision to publish, calling the images a saucy but harmless picture. Smith describes it as somewhat patronizing, the kind of phrase that reads as an attempt to minimize the violation rather than genuinely reckon with it. It didn't land the way Yelland hoped. Public sympathy kept moving towards Sophie, not away from her, week after week, and the paper eventually reversed course entirely, running a full-page apology under the headline, "Sorry, Sophie." A stunning about-face for a tabloid that rarely admitted fault so publicly. Chris Tarrant, the man photographed alongside her all those years earlier, went further still. On his Capitol Breakfast show in front of his entire listening audience, he addressed Cara Noble directly, on air. He denied any improper relationship with Sophie. That accusation had started circulating alongside the photos, adding another layer of damage to an already painful story. And then turned his attention to Noble herself. "How will you ever be able to look Sophie in the face again?" he asked. "I don't feel angry. I don't feel disgust. I feel deeply saddened. That's not the language of someone trying to protect a scandal from spreading further. That's the language of someone watching a friendship get sold for a number with a comma in it and struggling to process how quickly loyalty can collapse under the weight of a payment." Noble didn't disappear quietly after that. She was fired from her job at Heart Radio almost immediately, as the public reaction turned decisively against her rather than against Sophie. Whatever she believed the payout was worth going in, it came at a cost that followed her for years afterward. She eventually apologized, telling the Mail on Sunday that leaking the photographs was the biggest and most public mistake one could ever make, a rare, unusually blunt admission from someone at the center of a tabloid firestorm. Then she left the country, rebuilt a career thousands of miles away in the United States, doing voiceover work for major household brands, eventually hosting Miss World in the Seychelles. A different life on a different continent, shaped in no small part by 3 words a monarch had once said about her actions. Meanwhile, the wedding proceeded almost exactly as planned, as if the scandal had simply run out of oxygen. Smith's account, echoed by contemporary reporting from the time, describes it as a relatively modest ceremony by royal standards. No cathedral-scale spectacle, no 6-figure guest list stretching across an entire county, none of the extravagance that had defined earlier royal weddings that decade. Sophie arrived at St. George's Chapel with her father, Christopher Rhys-Jones, riding in a Rolls-Royce originally presented to the Queen for her Silver Jubilee back in 1978, a detail that in hindsight carries its own quiet symbolism, a car built for celebrating the Queen's reign, now carrying the woman the Queen had just defended, unflinchingly, against a national tabloid. There's something worth sitting with here. This wasn't a moment where Elizabeth II calculated the political cost of standing behind a future daughter-in-law before committing to a position. This was, by every account that's since surfaced, an immediate and deeply personal response, made without the usual layers of institutional caution. She and Sophie would go on to develop one of the closest relationships within the entire family. Sophie affectionately called her Mama, a nickname reserved for very few people who ever married into the Windsors, and one that speaks to a bond built on more than formality. That closeness didn't start after years of proving herself worthy of trust. It started, at least in part, in the days following a betrayal that could easily have gone very differently. Compare that to how other royal scandals unfolded in the decades that followed. Compare it to moments when family members were left largely to manage public crises on their own, without that kind of immediate, unambiguous backing from the very top of the institution. The contrast doesn't need much spelling out. It's right there in the timeline, visible to anyone who looks closely enough at how differently these moments can play out, depending on who happens to be standing behind you. What Sean Smith's biography adds isn't just a fresh telling of an old tabloid story that most people had half forgotten. It's the missing piece, the private reaction that never made it into any 1999 press statement, because Buckingham Palace doesn't typically publish the Queen's exact words about people who've wronged the family, however satisfying those words might be to the public. Those 3 words stayed inside the institution for over 25 years, surfacing only now, through interviews with people who were actually in the room or close enough to it to remember exactly what was said. Sophie went on to become, by some measures, one of the hardest working members of the family, well over 100 official engagements in a single recent year, stepping in for King Charles on multiple occasions when duty required it. 26 years into a marriage that has outlasted nearly every royal union of her generation, and the only one among the late Queen's children's marriages still standing with the original spouse, none of that erases what happened in the weeks before her wedding, or the fear she carried into St. George's Chapel that day. But it does put the Queen's early judgment in a different light entirely. She wasn't simply defending Sophie in a moment of crisis, out of instinct or obligation. She was, in a very real sense, betting on her. The £40,000 Cara Noble collected didn't buy what she probably expected it would. It didn't diminish Sophie in the eyes of the family or the public. It didn't derail a wedding, and it didn't fracture the institution's confidence in the woman about to join it. What it bought in the end was a permanent line in a biography describing exactly how badly that calculation backfired, and exactly how 3 private words from an 80-year-old monarch settled the matter before the ink on the tabloid's apology had even dried. It's worth pausing on why the Queen's language landed so differently than a standard palace response. Most royal crises of that era were handled through what insiders sometimes called the safety-first approach. No direct comment, no confirmation, no denial, just careful silence until the story faded on its own. That approach protected the institution, but it rarely protected the individual at the center of the storm. Sophie's situation could easily have followed the same script. Instead, the Queen broke from it entirely, and did so within days, not weeks. There's also the question of what Premeditated specifically pointed to. It wasn't just that Noble sold the photos and, plenty of tabloid scoops involved some degree of betrayal. It was the timing. Weeks before a wedding, when the damage would be maximized and the victim would have the least room to respond without appearing defensive. Smith's reporting suggests the Queen understood exactly what that timing meant and refused to let the calculation succeed. Cruelty in her framing wasn't incidental to the leak. It was the entire design behind it. That distinction shaped how the rest of the family responded too. There was no internal debate over whether Sophie's pre-royal life reflected poorly on her suitability for the family, a conversation that, by several accounts, had quietly happened around other prospective in-laws in years past. The Queen's early, decisive framing of the story closed that door before it could open. Once the matriarch called it cruelty rather than carelessness, the rest of the family's response fell into line behind her. There's still more from Smith's book worth unpacking, including what Sophie's early years inside the family reveal about how she earned that closeness with the Queen in the first place and what it cost her to get there. That's a story for another time.